Hello everyone, welcome to the Pima County Libertarian Party outreach meeting. We are pleased to have Peter Norquest with us, who is presenting on the Pact for the Future from the UN. I'm going to allow him to introduce himself, and this will be posted to our page and other places. We opted to get the audio visual working rather than start on time because this presentation is so important, we feel. So with that, Peter,
Yes.
Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Drew, for the introduction. So yeah, as Drew just mentioned, my name is Peter Norquest. I am the first vice chair of the Pima County Libertarian Party. I'm a visiting scholar at the U of A in the School of Anthropology and also affiliated with the Linguistics Department. And one of my foremost concerns and interests in the past few years has been studying some of the information that I'm going to be presenting today, primarily as it concerns the rollout of something called technocracy, which is a form of governmental management that is authoritarian and enabled with technology. Something that has been thought about and discussed for decades, if not centuries, but which was never really possible until now because the apparatus and the technology were not there. And so I will be discussing the Pact for the Future. The Pact for the Future was a document that was agreed to at the last General Assembly of the United Nations, which happened a little bit less than a month ago from the time of this recording, on September 22nd. And the United Nations, for anyone who's not familiar with their structure, they have an annual meeting called the General Assembly that usually meets around September. And then that General Assembly extends throughout the following year until they have the next one. So before I start talking about the Pact for the Future, I'm going to try to put it in some context. And at first, this may not seem immediately relevant, but I'm going to do my best to show you how it is. And I'm going to begin speaking about something called the Great Work. Really quickly, how many people are familiar with that term?
Magnum opus.
Okay. So the Latin for that is magnum opus. You're probably familiar with that, mostly from music. You've probably heard this or that person composed a magnum opus. It literally means it was their great work. And so what this refers to is something that stands for the spiritual path towards self-transcendence in its entirety. And the key term there is self-transcendence. And importantly, it is not something that anyone is helped with per se. It's about a person doing it for themselves. And there are two people who I want to quote real quick in this context. The first was an occultist named Eliphas Levi, who lived during the 19th century. And he discussed the concept of the great work at length, giving it a spiritual meaning by analogy to the alchemical magnum opus of perfecting lead into gold and mortality into immortality. So this was a case where the figurative symbol was the transition of lead into gold, although there were many alchemists who took that seriously and actually tried to achieve that. But what it really always stood for was the transition from mortality to immortality. And he said, the great work is before all things the creation of man by himself. That is to say, the full and entire conquest of his faculties and his future. It is especially the perfect emancipation of his will. So once again, this is man perfecting his will, making his will supreme so that he can achieve this. And then a later occultist by the name of Aleister Crowley, several of you probably at least recognize that name. He's one of the two people who's affiliated with modern-day Satanism, the other being Anton LaVey, who was the founder of the Church of Satan. Crowley referred to himself as the Great Beast, 666. And what he said about the great work is that it is the uniting of opposites. It may mean the uniting of the soul with God, of the microcosm with the macrocosm, of the female with the male, of the ego with the non-ego. So it's taking things which are naturally polar and merging them together into a single entity. And one of the categories I want you to take note of is the merging of the female with the male. I have a couple of symbols here decoratively on this first slide. The rest of my slides are going to be pretty dry, but I want to explain these briefly. These are both symbols that have been associated with the great work in different traditions. The one over here is the Hermetic symbol. This is the symbol that we get the term squaring the circle from, because you have a circle on the inside, squared, triangle around that, and then another circle. And that symbol has been associated with a figure called Hermes Trismegistus. And then the one over here is the Seal of Solomon, which you'll probably recognize, if from nowhere else, as from its modern incarnation on the flag of the modern state of Israel. And this has been associated with the great work because the meaning of the two triangles, you've got two intersecting triangles, one facing down, one facing up. The upward facing triangle represents material reality. It's what we experience as people here on earth in a physical existence. The downward facing triangle means the spirit world. And the two are normally separate, but the great work aims to bring them together so that they intersect and merge. So I just wanted to show that those are two different ways of expressing this in pictorial form. So what I want to connect with this, something that's more modern, is a term called transhumanism. And that is a term that is creeping more and more into the common vernacular. It was somewhat esoteric for several years. But just in the last couple of years, more and more people are hearing it, partly because of the big push by the World Economic Forum and people associated with that. And what transhumanism is, I'm going to quote directly from the Transhumanist Manifesto that was penned by a guy named Max Moore. And what he says is that it is a worldview that seeks a quality of life that brings about perpetual progress, self-transformation, practical optimism, visionary solutions, and critical thinking. The transhuman. The transhuman is a biological, technological organism, a transformation of the human species that continues to evolve with technology. And the connection here is that transhumanism is a modern form of the great work. It is man's own attempt to use his own resources to go from mortality to immortality through technological means. And the biologist Julian Huxley, who was the brother of Aldous Huxley, who you'll probably be familiar with through the book Brave New World, popularized the term transhumanism in a 1957 essay. The contemporary meaning of the term was foreshadowed by one of the first professors of futurology, interestingly, a guy who changed his name to FM 2030. And I believe that FM stands for Future Man. 2030 is significant because of its correlation with the modern Agenda 2030 of the United Nations, which I've given a separate presentation on a year before this here. And then another concept that I think intersects with this very closely is the concept of eugenics. Which is a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of a human population. Many critics, including myself, argue that transhumanism is a dangerous resurgence of many discriminatory attitudes and elitist ideals of the eugenics movement of the past. And eugenics has an interesting history. In a sense, it goes back probably a very long time. But in modern history, eugenics began to really be experimented with at the beginning of the 20th century through some of the foundations like the Carnegie Ford Foundation, Ford Foundation, and people associated with them, and they started experimenting with ways where they could manipulate the population physically to breed a more superior person in a physical sense. But the offshoot of this led to a lot of attitudes and views about inferiority of people, either based on race or gender, disability, and so on, and discussion about ways to cull them from the population. Not always violently, but making sure that they would not reproduce through sterilization procedures, not always consented to, things like that. And so that is what sort of provides the intersection between the concept of eugenics and transhumanism, because they both rely, in a sense, on the concept of Darwinian evolution, which is survival of the fittest. And the implicit message behind survival of the fittest is that the strong not only survive, but in a sense they deserve to survive by crowding out weaker people or weaker organisms that are going to fall out along the way, along an evolutionary timeline. So that's one of the things that I think is problematic with transhumanism, because it leads, in a sense, to a very non-compassionate view towards other people, and almost a cutthroat ideology that is not normally verbalized, but I think a lot of people like Noah Yuval Harari of the World Economic Forum, for example, hold implicitly. There are modern terms for the great work that people are more or less familiar with. The most broad term that goes back and was made popular first in a speech by George Bush Sr. is the New World Order. And what the New World Order is something that it refers to a new period of history evidencing dramatic change in world political thought and the balance of power in international relations. It's commonly associated with the notion of world governance. I would actually add that it is always associated with that. It's just not always articulated that way for political reasons. The New World Order, in turn, embeds a second, more recent concept called the Great Reset, which is an economic recovery plan that was drawn up by the World Economic Forum in response to the COVID pandemic. The project was launched in June of 2020, and a video featuring the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles, was released to mark its launch. The initiative's stated aim is to facilitate rebuilding from the global COVID crisis in a way that prioritizes sustainable development. And for anyone not familiar with that term, what sustainable development is, it's the key foundation of the United Nations Agenda 2030, and is an example of the way that words are used in sort of a dual-use fashion. In an esoteric sense on the one hand and exoterically on the other. What that means is that there's a small group of people who really understand the core meaning on the inside. There's a much broader group, a larger group, who are assumed to take it at face value and understand a different meaning. That's the rest of us. So I argue that sustainable in this context is really just a euphemism for control. And then embedded within the Great Reset is something called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is a rapid technological advancement in the 21st century. A part of this phase of industrial change is the joining of technologies like artificial intelligence, gene editing, and advanced robotics that blur the lines between the physical, digital, and biological worlds, something that is known as biodigital convergence. And this is directly related to transhumanism, because transhumanism aims to use as its vehicle biodigital convergence to turn everyone essentially into cyborgs who will prolong their lives and ultimately live forever, and in different ways depending on which schema that you look at. It's a program that seems to have been going on since 1957 with NASA, because NASA, if you look at documents that go back to that time, which was close to their inception, had a goal through space exploration to turn people into cyborgs. No one really is aware of that, no one talks about it, but the documents exist. And it seems to have been one of the core drivers of NASA's experimentation and then their drive to go into space. And the other thing I want to mention, going back to the Seal of Solomon becoming the emblem on the flag of the State of Israel, something else many people don't realize is that the modern State of Israel is one of the biggest drivers of biodigital convergence right now. And if you do a search, you can find plenty of YouTube videos about it where they talk about it in their own words. But they are massively pushing through technologies that have to do with transhumanism and biodigital convergence. And they're really kind of a seedbed for the rest of the world, primarily in the private sphere, although there is some private-public partnership stuff going on with them. So The next thing that I want to explain is this is not limited just to people. The great work is not limited just to people. It is actually an intended transmutation of our entire physical realm. And the goal seems to be to convert everything into sort of an artificial simulacrum of actual reality by converting everything into something that is half material, half technological, and then mirroring it through digital twins, which are already in use in multiple industries. Like the aerospace industry has been using digital twins for years, because digital twins allow for people to make shortcuts in terms of development. What a digital twin is it's just a digital replica of something in real 3D space-time. And so if you do it at a fine enough grain detail, you're able to solve problems by just going to the digital twin rather than having to do nuts and bolts experiments in real life. But this is happening at 3 levels. So there's the macroscopic, mesoscopic, and microscopic levels. Mesoscopic is where we exist, usually. Humans, what we can see in real space in real time. Macroscopic, as the term implies, are things that are too large to see, microscopic, too small to see. And so the macroscopic level involves things like geoengineering, which includes things like massive sensor drops, that go directly to the microscopic level, but it involves the dropping of sensors throughout the environment that then go on to start to populate the surface layer of the ground and other things. What Ilana Freeland calls the space fence, which is basically the low Earth orbit satellite layer that has been populated massively in the last several years, especially in the couple of years leading up to 2020 and then afterwards. And then things on the ground like NEXRADs, ionospheric heaters, and so on. And those do a number of things, and all of these technologies interact together. I would argue that the primary purpose is for visualization and scanning, but there's an argument that can be made for things like weather modification and manipulation, like some people talked about recently with Hurricane Helene. The mesoscopic layer involves 5G interacting with IoT, the Internet of Things. That is the item-to-item communication layer that occurs between our smart devices, our smart meters, going out into fusion centers, and more integrating directly with us. First through exterior cybernetic implants, if you will, things like our smartphones, our earbuds, smartwatches, Fitbits, but ultimately intended to go inside the body. And there are already people pushing to get people to adopt some of that early technology, chips in the hands and so on. And then, so the smart infrastructure that goes along with that, and I would argue the push toward what I consider to be human farms, which are the dense urban centers that we are being moved into slowly but surely. So that will be a combination of smart cities and 15-minute cities where people will be more easily monitored and controlled through a variety of different technologies, including various autonomous technologies. And then the wildland lines that those will vacate. So the United Nations and its associated groups have a few major scale plans on the books that they're working with right now, trying to give carrots to federal governments around the world so that they will start moving people out of the wildlands and into the urbans. And they claim that it's to conserve nature, but I think that that is only a political hook. What I think will actually happen, if and when they're successful moving people out to the extent that people are no longer allowed back in, will be the beginning of strip mining for resources. Kind of like, again, what people think might have happened in North Carolina because of the association with things like lithium and quartz. And then finally, there's the microscopic level. So this involves 6G, which is being worked on. Many companies they hope to roll this out by 2030. It would interact with the IOB, which is similar to but different from the IoT. The IOB is the Internet of Bodies. This would be fully integrated systems within our bodies that allow real-time monitoring and feedback using 6G into the external environment. So the idea is that we would have implanted brain chips, nanobots in our blood system, all sorts of nanotech. Some people have made very good arguments that that was part of the reason for the rollout of the COVID shots, was to start to build that platform out. I agree with that based on what I've seen. Other technologies include things like CRISPR, which is a gene editing technology, very important in the transhumanist plan. And then again, the sensors, the microscopic sensors. And all of this will feed into what's called the global information grid. You can look that up online. There's a great Wikipedia article about it. The global information grid grew out of an earlier program called the Sentient World Simulation that was hosted at one of the California universities. And the aim of the Sentient World Simulation was to build out a map of digital twins that covered the entire Earth, and was not limited to humans. It would include other organisms like animals and plants, and as well as inanimate objects like even furniture. And at some point it got acquired by the Department of Defense, which is why the name changed when the name changed to the Global Information Grid. So it is properly and officially a project of the DoD now. So now moving more specifically toward the Pact to the Future, and you'll have to take it on faith that everything I just gave you background-wise is going to illuminate this topic. And we're going to start moving toward that directly now. The Club of Rome is a think tank that was established in 1968 by a couple of people originally in Italy, hence the name the Club of Rome, although it's changed its headquarters a couple of times. What they were concerned with was basically, how do we regulate policy, global policy around the world in a way that is efficient and good for the planet? And so they published this book called The Limits of Growth in 1972. And one of the key phrases from this book was, in searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which must be confronted by everyone together. But in designating these dangers as the enemy, we fall into the trap, which we have already warned readers about, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes. And it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. And so what I want you to take away from this is a couple of things. First, note that in 1972, they were already talking about global warming. And this is in an era that went into the 1980s when you were looking at popular magazines like Time, for example, they were still talking about being worried about an ice age. Right? And that narrative changed, especially when Al Gore kind of came on the stage. But the idea of using global warming had its inception right around this time. And then the key thing that I've put in bold there is that the idea that they had to be able to convince people to do what they wanted to would be to convince us that we were our own worst enemy, that humanity was the enemy of both the planet as well as ourselves. And so this is something that intersects very closely with many of the United Nations policies that I'm going to be looking at. So moving forward in time to this year, in August, just a couple of months ago, the Club of Rome and the Council for the Human Future published a report on a roundtable discussion that they co-hosted in July. The report, called The Roundtable on the Human Future, A World Call to Action on the Multiple Crises Now Unfolding Humanity, says that all human life could be extinguished in the mid to latter half of the 21st century, the one we're in right now, due to climate change, overpopulation, new pandemics, misinformation, nuclear proliferation, and other perceived threats with an emphasis on perceived. So what they're doing here is they're laying out their list of topics that they wish to use to fearmonger with. And having said that, it doesn't mean that any of these topics are not of concern per se, but they are not really concerned about any of these for the sake of them themselves. They want to use them as weapons psychologically to convince people that we need to allow other people to intervene for us so that we don't face a species extinction based on a combination of any number one of these. So in June, the Global Governance Forum had already called for a rewriting of the UN Charter, which is called UN 2.0. There's an actual website for that, and you can look for that. The Roundtable report also proposed the creation of a world parliament, a global truth commission dealing with mis and disinformation, a global currency, and a plan to reduce 3/4 of the human population. And since I'm speaking specifically to a libertarian audience tonight, either in person or hopefully eventually online, I want you to take note of these because these are some of the most statist proposals that you could imagine. Government getting bigger than any of us have ever really imagined, unless you're really studying this particular topic. So the Roundtable report identified threats and solutions to several polycrises, and I touched on those in the previous slide, but I'm going to show you in more detail now. So they talked about a fresh nuclear arms race with dangerous new weapons and killer robots, and I'm sure other things as well. And notice they never really say anything like, maybe we shouldn't do this at all. They're just stating the fact that it's happening and taking it implicitly that it's going to happen no matter what. Uncontrolled technologies like AI, biotech, nanotech, and universal surveillance. True, all of those are problems. Misinformation and mass delusion, paralyzing society's ability to save itself. Overpopulation, human numbers vastly exceeding the Earth's carrying capacity, which no one ever really defines. And then finally, new pandemic diseases, arriving out of ruined environments and or science labs. So kind of following the Wuhan lab narrative, which I'm not going to argue is either true or false. I'm just saying that they have basically established that as the narrative they want to tack on to, along with ruined environments that would be the fault of we humans. And the solutions that they proposed then, just going into a little bit more detail, are a total ban on nuclear weapons. Something that you'll see come up several times in the Pact for the Future material is global disarmament, which I find interesting in the context of what we've seen here more recently in the States. We've had a conversation politically about whether or not it's a good thing for the population to be disarmed for our own good. Once again, I'm speaking to libertarians. We have our own argument about why that's a bad idea, but in general, I think there's a good general argument that if as soon as a population is disarmed, they're much easier to control. Because not everyone is disarmed across the board, it's only the citizens, it's not the government, right? This is that same thing on a worldwide level. So if you want to establish a global government, it will be in your best interest to neuter people in terms of their carrying capacity armament-wise. And I'm not arguing that nuclear weapons are a good thing, but they could become a problem if not everyone wants to go along with the plan. And there are several nuclear states, I think there's 11 right now. Many of them have signed on to various treaties, but a few, like India and Pakistan, haven't. So this is a big deal for them. The second thing they propose is a circular global economy that does not waste or pollute. The circular economy is a technocratic idea of basically using only the bare minimum of resources that you need to per the amount of people who are using those and recycling them infinitely. So never drawing any additional resources in from the outside environment. A World Technology Commission to oversight safe use of dangerous new technologies and prevent future pandemics. And they don't really get specific about how that commission would be established, but it is, again, implicit that it wouldn't be elected, it would be appointed. A Global Truth Commission, again, to deal with misinformation and disinformation, because we all know by now how dangerous those are. A plan to voluntarily lower the human population, which I mentioned, and then an Earth system currency, which would be a global interoperable digital currency. So something that was uniformly compatible around the world. There would no longer be different national currencies. Everything would be vanilla, the same at the global level. And that is a whole discussion in itself, but the problem is that the people who would be in charge of that would be the people who would be at the top of this very small global government. And digital currency rather carries several sets of risks. For one thing, it's part of what's called the going direct system that they want to establish, where they want to create a direct connection between the central banks and us, basically kicking out the middleman, which would be our credit unions, our banks, and so on. So we would lose our privacy absolutely in that situation. Digital currency also has other things that could be problematic that have been discussed. It could be made to be finite, so it could be essentially like a voucher with an expiration date, for example. And it could be turned off, and it could be linked to a social credit score. All of those are risks with this. So now let me get to the Pact itself. So the Pact for the Future was adopted unanimously on September 22nd, 2024, so a little bit less than a month ago. Russia introduced an amendment to the Pact that would have watered it down considerably to our benefit, stressing the preeminence of national jurisdictions. So basically what the amendment amounted to would be that the Pact would apply in a limited sense within national boundaries and only in an absolute sense outside of those on the larger global stage. 7 nations voted in favor of that amendment and 15 nations abstained, but unfortunately 143 voted against the amendment, basically voting for the United Nations being able to reach directly inside countries to interfere with their business. So this at least got 22 nations on record as not being overwhelmingly happy about the Pact. Then the Pact passed unanimously. The General Assembly adopted it without a vote through a process called silent assent, which means that if no one objects, then it's considered to be passed, and no nation broke the consensus. The one good thing that came out of this is there are actions I'm going to go through in a little bit in each section of the Pact. The final action, Action 57, was called the Emergency Platform Clause. And this is by far the thing that most people were concerned about. So it was amended from the final draft about 48 hours before the actual assembly met to discuss it. And the way that it read was, we request the Secretary General to present for the consideration of member states protocols for convening and operationalizing emergency platforms based on flexible approaches to respond to a range of different complex global shocks, including criteria for triggering and phasing out emergency platforms. And the way that people were reading that was that if the United Nations and through the Secretary General declared a global emergency, which could be any number of things. It could be another pandemic, it could be a space threat, it could be a military threat, a nuclear threat, or a black swan event, or an economic crash. Then power would go to the Secretary General to basically become a world dictator in a lot of ways. And it would be up to him and the people who consult with him to unilaterally decide on the criteria to declare that emergency, and it would also be up to them to declare the criteria by which the emergency would be ended. And so we know from what we've seen with COVID, especially in the first couple of years, but in the last few, that that is very problematic. It's very problematic when someone decides they can unilaterally declare an emergency and then take emergency actions which are not necessarily constitutional at either the state or the federal level, right? So that was gone, and there's something else that came in second to replace it that I'll look at after a little bit. But I just wanted to say that many people did breathe a sigh of relief when they cut this at the last minute. And I think they did that because they were worried that it may not actually pass if they left that clause in. So some observations I have about the language of the Pact for the Future itself. The document on paper, when I loaded it into a Word document, is about 66 pages. It took me 2 weeks to read it. I had to take breaks. And the language, first, is very vague. It's repetitive. And I think it's eerily utopian. When you read the language, it's almost like a person didn't write it. I'm not saying that is the case, but it's weird sounding if you ever want to go and check it out yourself. It doesn't lay out any clear path to achieve proposed goals. Rather, it appears to provide language that allows for very broad interpretation, which may be useful for justifying a variety of endeavors. So what I think about it is that everything is vague on purpose because it allows people to interpret it to their benefit. And what it reminds me of coming from academia is when you're in academia and you want to apply for grants, you look for granting agencies that have programs that fit the project that you want to work on. And it is often the case that you cannot find a program that fits exactly what you want to get money for, what you want to get funding for. So people will go through some contortions and put some real effort into kind of shoehorning a square peg into a round hole to dress up the language of the proposal so that will fit better with what the granting agency is asking for. And this seems very much like that to me. So it's leaving the door wide open for people who want to dress language up for a lot of things in such a way that they will fit with this. The Pact refers to multiple other declarations, resolutions, agendas, etc. I'll show you some examples in a bit. And I think it may be important that adoption of the Pact embeds implicitly the adoption of all other reference documents. There are a lot of them, and what I think might happen is that it may be argued in the future that because you signed this pact, you have automatically agreed to follow everything that is embedded within the pact as well. And then, as with other UN documents, the vocabulary used can carry a dual meaning, like I just mentioned. So I already talked about the word sustainable, basically being a euphemism for control or controlled. Another good example is multilateral. I believe that's a euphemism for global. So just bear that in mind, and I might point examples of that out as I go. So here's the overview of the document itself. It's in 5 main sections. The first is on sustainable development and financing for that development. The second is on international peace and security. The third is science, technology, and innovation and digital cooperation. The fourth is youth and future generations, and the fifth is transforming global governance. Out of all of these, I'll just tell you ahead of time, I think the scariest ones are 3 and 5. And then they've got 2 annexes. The first is the Global Digital Compact, which appends to Section 3. And then the second annex, the Declaration on Future Generations, with appends to Section 4. And they were placed in there later to kind of beef those sections up once the initial drafts had been written. So, regarding these documents that are embedded, I have examples in here for every section. I'm not going to always go through these for every section. That'll get a little bit tedious, but I want to give you one example at least. And I'm not going to give you any of the actual text. That would keep us here for 2 weeks, probably. I'm only going to go over the bullet points of the actions. But in the preamble, none of which I've actually repeated here, the documents that are referenced just in the preamble include the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Beijing Declaration, which involves the rights of women, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, which was another climate agreement, and then finally the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So those are all referred to just in the preamble before we actually start the meat of the document itself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the document according to the actions that are proposed in each section and just try to give you a flavor of what's involved and unpack it a little bit along the way. So the first section on sustainable development has 12 actions altogether. The first one deals with implementing the 2030 Agenda, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and leaving no one behind. And I bolded leave no one behind there because I want everyone to understand what they mean by that. They're talking about inclusiveness here and inclusion, but not in the way that we're led to think, not in sort of a goody-goody social justice way. What they're saying here is that we mean for everyone to be absorbed into the system, and we don't want anyone to be running wild outside of it. We will leave no one behind. Okay, and you'll see this language appear at various places throughout the rest of the document, but I think that's in there very intentionally. The second action is about eradication of poverty, which is basically reiterating SDG 1. The third one is about ending hunger and eliminating food insecurity. That's SDG 2. Action 4, they're stating that they want to close the Sustainable Development Goal financing gap in developing countries. And what I think is important about this is they a few times talk about financing developing countries. And what I think the intention is here is to throw a carrot out to the developing countries because they outnumber the developed so-called countries. And at this point in time, a lot of what happens at the United Nations does depend on majority votes amongst the delegates. So they are offering the developed countries an incentive to buy in here by basically saying we're going to redistribute wealth and we're going to put mechanisms in place to basically take wealth from the developed countries as well as do technology transfers and so on and move them to the developing countries. So you're basically going to get all of that gratis. And all you have to do is raise your hand and vote with us here. The fifth action is about the multilateral trading system. Remember, I'm arguing that multilateral is a euphemism for global. So they're talking about moving the trade system to the absolutely global level along the lines of things like NAFTA, for example. So getting away from nationally regulated trade along with tariffs and all the headaches that come along with that. And having it regulated by independent agencies that don't have any particular national allegiance. Action 6 is about investing in people to end poverty and strengthening trust and social cohesion. 7 is about efforts to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels, and upholding human rights and fundamental freedoms. I'm going to unpack this a little bit. This is a long one. So the first one, peaceful, just, and inclusive. You have to ask what is meant by those. Peaceful, I think, goes to their disarmament language. I think it basically has to do with we can induce peace largely by making sure only the authorities are armed. Everyone else is disarmed. And that's a very easy way to achieve a form of peace, right? Just really depends on how you define just, but one of the things they talk about later is massively strengthening the International Justice Court, which they intend to be the court for the world, basically. And so I think that's really sticky because they leave it undefined, and I think that's on purpose. Inclusive, we've talked about, and then we're going to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Again, those are not defined, but the people defining them are going to be the ones on that end of the draft, not on the other end. And then upholding human rights and fundamental freedoms. This one is interesting because human rights is something that we, especially as Americans, have embedded into our social consciousness. And there are certain things that we think of when someone uses the phrase human rights. But in the language of this document, they list a few examples, fortunately, of what they consider to be human rights. And amongst those are things like digital inclusion. So everyone has the right to have online access all the time. Vaccination. Everyone has the right to be regularly vaccinated, probably specifically with mRNA shots. And then reproductive health access, which goes right back to eugenics. Right? Because the eugenicists are all about using reproductive health to curb the world population. You know, their tried and true forms were things like abortion, birth control, and so on. So I think this particular item says a lot. 8 is about gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. They go to this a lot, making things equal for the genders. What I have to offer about this is that I think that one has to ask what is meant by equality, because again, we think of equality as people being unequal and the people who are lower down here being raised up to the level of the people who enjoy things that they don't enjoy. But really, this group of people can be lowered and people can be made to be equal there too. So that's one thing to remember about this. The other is that equality of gender can begin to be absolutely material. I think this actually intersects with the push for transgenderism that is ultimately a transhuman paradigm. And the way that I kind of illustrate this for people is, so what I mentioned about this move towards cyborgism, the sci-fi example I use for this are, if you're a Trekkie, the Borg. And if you're familiar with them, the Borg are an alien race in Star Trek that are cybernetic beings. They grow their population two ways, either artificially in sort of the Aldous Huxley way or by assimilating other people technologically. But they're genderless. They have a gender before they're assimilated, but once they are, they become neuter, they become a drone. And so I think that may be something sort of in a general sense along the lines of where the United Nations and WEF are going when they talk about gender issues and empowerment of women. Action 9 is about strengthening their actions to address climate change. I've already talked about how that is sort of a sword of Damocles that is being held over people's heads to motivate them to do different things. 10 reflects that, restoring, protecting, conserving, and sustainably using the environment. The key word being sustainably. In other words, we're going to control everything minutely. 11, talking about culture and sport. I find that one interesting. It's new language for them, and I don't really know where they're going with that. Culture, one can assume that they want everyone's culture around the world to become more homogeneous, and to reflect these values that we're discussing. And sport, you got me, unless it involves NFL halftime shows. That's the only thing I can think there. So, if you get there before I do, let me know if you have an epiphany about what they're going to do with sports. And finally, 12 is about turbocharging the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development by 2030 and beyond. So getting serious, because when they had the predecessor to the 2030 SDGs, they had what were called the Millennial Goals. There were 11 of them. They ran between the years 2000 and 2015. They were able to achieve a certain amount of their goals under those, but not nearly as much as they wanted. So they rebooted in 2015 for the 2030 goals. And they're really trying to amp it up. And I think what happened with COVID was their first onslaught to try to really start to transform society along the timeline that they have envisioned. Partly because it seemed so hurried, and in some ways it was kind of botched. It was definitely powerful and affected all of us, but it had this quality to it that led one to feel like maybe they would have liked to have had a little bit more time before rolling that out the way that they did. So these are some of the things that are referenced in the first section. I'm not going to go take the time to go over them. It's going to take too long. If you would like a copy of this or want to see it later, just ask. International peace and security. There's another 12 action items. So this is the one that is largely about disarmament, but it embeds a few other things too. So 13 is about redoubling efforts to build and sustain peaceful, inclusive, and just societies. There you have that triad again. And address the root causes of conflicts. This is interesting because you have to wonder, what are the root causes of conflicts? Right? They leave it vague, but based on other things that they say, one might think that misinformation and disinformation could be a root cause of conflict. Because people have argued that social media was used in planning revolutions, right, in previous decades. So we might just need to control that a little bit better. You might think that nationalism or populism could be a root cause of conflict. And this is an example of how I was trying to explain how you can take something that is very vague and apply any number of ideas to it, right? 14 is about protecting civilians in armed conflict, good enough as it goes. 15 is about ensuring that people affected by humanitarian emergencies receive the support they need. So what do you mean by those? You have to define both of those terms. Do they want to do it the way that happened recently in North Carolina? Because I suppose FEMA might argue that people there received the support they needed according to FEMA's own criteria, but not most of the criteria of people who were there on the ground, right? 16 is about promoting cooperation and understanding to diffuse tensions, seek the pacific settlement of disputes and resolve conflicts. vague again. How are we going to do that? We would assume it would be through diplomatic means, good enough, but it could be through sanctions, which I'll get to a little bit later. It could be through the use of a growing number of blue helmets, we don't know. And then 17 talks about fulfilling our obligation to comply with the decisions and uphold the mandate of the International Court of Justice, which I mentioned before, in which they say later that they want to strengthen considerably. 18 is about building and sustaining peace. Again, vague, how do you intend to do that? 19 is about implementing commitments to women, peace and security. 20 is the same thing, except instead of women, it's youth. 21 is about adapting peace operations. What do we mean? Because peacekeeping is a euphemism of boots on the ground with weapons with the United Nations, right? They're called peacekeeping forces. And then 22 is about the serious impact of threats to maritime security and safety. I think this is a clause just for good measure because most of this is understood to be terrestrial, but they want to make sure that we include everything on the sea as well, and they get to space later. And then the last set of action points here, they want to pursue a future free from terrorism. How do you define terrorism, right? There's certain people, including libertarians, who other people have alleged are terrorists, right? 24 is about preventing and combating transnational organized crime and related illicit financial flows. I think this is interesting because how do you combat that? We would like to think that maybe they would be enforcing law at different scales to make sure that they stamp it out, but you could just as easily absorb it and legalize it as long as they were playing for your team. 25 is about advancing the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. I kind of talked about that already. 26, upholding disarmament obligations and commitments. Again, disarming people. Everyone except the UN themselves and their friends. And then 27 is about seizing the opportunities associated with new and emerging technologies and addressing the potential risks posed by their misuse. So this is, again, those next generation weapons that are being employed along with new technologies like artificial intelligence. An example I give that I think Davis Monthan is in possession of right now is this interesting outfit where you have a lead plane that for now has a human pilot, but you have a drone entourage that is associated with that plane and communicates with it. So it moves as a single organism, basically. And so the drones are able to move out or fall back from the plane itself and can hit targets without the plane ever actually having to directly intercept itself. You can imagine a further stage where the plane itself is automated in the sense of a driverless vehicle, and then that being a multi-pronged weapon, right? With different moving parts that are all interconnected. And so they never say maybe we ought to hold back and consider whether or not we should do these. It's always taken as a given that we're going to do it. We just need to regulate it. Who's going to do it? Us, right? Okay, so that's the end of that section. Again, these are some of the agreements that are referred to that I will not go over now. I do want to point out this one at the bottom I think is interesting. The group of governmental experts on emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapons systems, which goes with that last point. That's a UN working group right there. Okay, moving on to the third section, science, technology, and innovation in digital cooperation. So if you'll remember, for me, I said it's a toss-up between whether this section or the final section is the scariest. But for this section, there are only 6 action items. I've got them all right here. 28 is sort of the umbrella statement. It talks about seizing the opportunity presented by science, technology, and innovation for the benefit of people and planet. Okay, what is that benefit? I'm going to refer back to what I said about the great work and the new technological version of that, because it's about terraforming, I think. 29 is about scaling up the means of implementation to developing countries, to strengthen them in this capacity. So there's another carrot to the developing countries. Technology transfer this time, not money. Action 30 is about ensuring that these things contribute to the full enjoyment of human rights. I discussed that. 31, ensuring that they improve gender equality in the lives of all women and girls. I already touched on that, but keep in mind now this is all talking specifically about technology, right? 32 is about protecting, building on, and complementing indigenous, traditional, and local knowledge. I think a large part of that would be to digitize everything. So take traditional knowledge around the world and get it all into the global database. And then 33 is about supporting the Secretary General to strengthen the role of the UN in supporting international cooperation in science, technology, and innovation. So get rid of proprietary technology, except in the case of the UN itself. Make everything interoperable, interlocking. And so the Global Digital Compact, the first appendix that gives this some teeth, has 5 objectives, and they are these. So the first one is to close all digital divides and accelerate progress across the Sustainable Development Goals. So there we have that closure language again. We're going to close the gaps, get rid of the divides, make sure everyone is hooked up online, which was, I believe, one of the stated purposes originally for the internet when it was originally the ARPANET. And this is what Obama phones were for. You know, why do we need to make sure all of the poor and homeless people out there have a phone? Well, we need to get them into the system so that we can start the monitoring. This is why if you go into different parts of Africa, for example, you can go into the bush and find people leading a very traditional lifestyle where they've got like only their herd of animals and their smartphones. Right? Because seriously, there have been programs to make sure that that's the one thing that they have. Objective 2 is about expanding inclusion and benefits from the digital economy for all. Again, there's inclusion. You have to ask what the benefits are because they derive benefits. It's not so clear that we do. 3 is fostering an inclusive, open, safe, and secure digital space that respects, protects, and promotes human rights. So again, we're making sure that people they all have access to the rights that we dictate are the rights they should have access to. 4 is about advancing responsible, equitable, and interoperable data governance approaches. So again, that's about linking everything up. And then 5 is about enhancing international governance of artificial intelligence for the benefit of humanity. This is a really big one. If you go to the document itself, there's actually considerable language about artificial intelligence that's dispersed throughout the document. It's clear that it's a very important technology and platform for them. And I think that explains largely why we've basically had it shoved in our face so much, especially in 2024. Because governance is going digital and artificial. And I think that there is a long-term goal, but as short as possible, to make sure that human governance systems are transferred over to AI as quickly and as much as possible so that it can start making the decisions that we're too stupid to make and too clumsy and we argue too much, etc., right? Okay, so the Global Digital Compact references all of these items. Again, I'm going to skip over all of them, except, again, I think the last one's kind of interesting. It's the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which is another UN group. The 4th one is pretty short. I don't need to spend too much time on this. It only has 4 action items, interestingly. So youth and future generations. What I think is happening here is that there is a big push to include youth because we want to propagandize them because of just the nature of humanity. Humanity is mortal. You know, we're trying to become immortal, but that's going to be probably ultimately sort of a classist maneuver when we get further along the timeline. They're just not letting us know that yet. But the more we try to basically propagandize the youth now, they grow up and become responsible adults within the United Nations framework. And people like us eventually are going to die off, right? I mean, if they can't get rid of us any other way, we're finite and we're going to leave. So it's important to capture the youth now. The Nazis knew this, right? And probably numerous other totalitarian groups around the world. So here's what they want to do. 34 is investing in the social and economic development of children and young people so that they can reach their full potential, whatever that means to them. 35 is about promoting, protecting, and respecting the human rights, again, of all young people, and fostering social inclusion and integration. So remember, the examples they give of human rights are digital inclusion, vaccines, and and reproductive health. So that's what they want for all young people. Social inclusion is making sure everyone's together on the same page. Integration, integrating everyone in so everyone plays a part in kind of the larger whole. 36 is about strengthening meaningful youth participation at the national level. So we got to get them participating. And 37 is the same thing, except instead of national, it's international level. And then that moves into the Declaration on Future Generations, the second appendix, or the second annex, actually, which doesn't have specific bullet points for me to give you. It's all text. I would encourage you to go look at it, but it does refer to certain previous agreements again. And then I also want to mention, I've got here at the bottom of the screen, 2 WEF programs. One is called the Young Global Leaders, the other is called the Global Shapers. And they are hierarchical. So the Young Global Leaders is a national leader program, and this is the one that is more commonly known to people who pay attention to the alt news. So this is the program that produced people like Trudeau. Macron was a young global leader. Also, people like Tulsi Gabbard was one, although they've scrubbed her profile, and Ivanka Trump was a young global leader as well, which is interesting because some of the policies of Trump that people are most critical of are ones that Ivanka and her husband, Jared Kushner, are most involved in. So the Global Shapers, on the other hand, is a community level organization. It's meant to be down at the county and city level. And we have our own Tucson Global Shapers. You can look them up online. I did it a couple years ago and loaded it into a document. Last time I looked, they had their names and faces, 10 or 12 bright and shiny young people. They look like wonderful people who are being groomed by the World Economic Forum to buy into this ideology. Okay, and so finally, the last section that I want to go to here is the other one that I think is pretty scary. It's a little bit longer. It's about transforming global governance. And this is the section about how do we make the first 4 sections happen? What are we going to do? So in 38, they talk about transforming global governance and reinvigorating the multilateral system to tackle challenges. So again, multilateral is another way to say global, right? Action 39 is about reforming the Security Council. And there are several points here. I've put them together. Well, they line up automatically about the Security Council. And I thought that was interesting. Who here knows what the Security Council does at the United Nations? Okay, I didn't either. So you can go to their page and look them up. They list, I think, 10 or 12 different responsibilities and bullet points that they're responsible for. The 2 that stood out to me were that they are responsible for imposing sanctions on countries, and they are also responsible for actually putting boots on the ground with armed soldiers for peacekeeping missions that the UN designates are necessary for those. And so talking about transforming the Security Council, reforming it, and strengthening it is actually kind of serious business, because that is talking about beefing up the United Nations military arm, essentially, into something that is much bigger than what it is right now. Action 40 is about strengthening efforts in the framework of the intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reform, so still related. 41, strengthening the response of the Security Council for maintenance of international peace and security. And remember, peace can be peace through strength, right? It can be peace because someone's got a gun to someone else's head. 42 is about increasing efforts to revitalize the work of the General Assembly. The General Assembly, if you don't know, is just the Delegate Assembly. They're the ones who actually did this silent assent for the Pact of the Future. All of the 193 member countries send a delegate, and they make up the GA. And then they talk about strengthening the Economic and Social Council to accelerate sustainable development. That is about starting to retool the economic system in a way that is more ESG friendly. And then they talk about strengthening the Peace Building Commission and the United Nations system. 46 is about ensuring the effective enjoyment by all of the human rights and respond to new and emerging challenges. So there's your human rights again and new and emerging challenges, which they're basically telling us these are going to come. We're telegraphing, be ready to see these new challenges because we're going to have to do something about them when they happen. And they're going to be used to strengthen our influence and our control. 47 is about accelerating reform of the international finance architecture to address the challenges of today and tomorrow. This is another one. I'm just going to move on to the next page. They have multiple points. All of these points right here, 48 through 52, are about reforming the international financial architecture for various means. And what that means is the going direct reset, where we move to a fully digital model, going directly from central bank to your bank account, which is fully digital, then being able to look directly into it and then manipulate it appropriately, connecting to social credit systems, and so on. So they talk about it in 48 in the context of representing developing countries, so you guys can join us. 49 is about financing the SDGs, responding to the needs of developing countries, again, into those most in need. 50 is about borrowing sustainably. The organizations that they mention in the text that they want to be the lending organizations are first and foremost the International Monetary Fund, and then secondarily the World Bank and the World Trade Organization is supposed to be on that too. 51 is interesting. Let's see. Yeah, there's more. Okay, one more page after this about the actions. They talk here about strengthening capacity to support developing countries more effectively and equitably during systemic shocks and making the financial system more stable. So that goes back to what I just said again, and the shocks that they're telegraphing that are coming down the pike. And then 52 sort of does a little tip of the hat to climate change there in terms of the international finance system. And then finally, staying on that theme, the last four goals, 53 talks about developing a framework on measures of progress on sustainable development to complement and go beyond GDP. So they're wanting to get away from a GDP model, which has to do with actual material resources and our ability to quantify those resources. And the reason that we want to do this is because that's an obstacle to going all digital. We need to go into a system where we're not really worried about quantifying our economic and monetary assets in a purely materialistic way, or even in a partially materialistic way. 54 is about strengthening the international response to complex global shocks. So these two items that talk about the complex global shocks, these were the ones that were brought in when they dropped Action 57. The emergency platform clause that I mentioned everyone was worried about. So they got rid of those, and these I think are the replacements. 55 is about strengthening partnerships to deliver on existing commitments and addressing new and emerging challenges again. And then 56 is about strengthening international cooperation for the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes and for the benefit of all humanity. And they mentioned space a couple of times in this document, and I think it's interesting because I believe that they're considering space to be one of their 5 spheres of influence that they talk about. The others being the cryosphere, which is ice, I forget the others, but it's like ice, land, water, air, space. Oh, and the digital sphere is the other one, the cybersphere, is where they want to be active. So these are agreements that they reference in this section. The last one again is the interesting one to me. It connects to the 67 Outer Space Treaty, but they are planning to have a United Nations conference on the peaceful exploration of outer space, abbreviated Unispace 4, in the year 2027. Where they intend to actually discuss what's going on primarily in low Earth orbit, I think, even more there. So I have a couple of pages of the organizations they reference. I'm not going to take the time to go over them. I just kind of want to show you what they have here. The second one involves some of the groups that people might be more familiar with, like the International Court of Justice, IMF, World Bank, WTO, the Group of 20, the African Union is here. And then, again, they've got their high-level advisory body on artificial intelligence, which it looks like they're really trying to build out. So that's the end of the summary of the document, which I can take questions later about if you have any. But I want to close in about the final third of my presentation, just discussing some of the implications and questions that people have. So you mentioned earlier, since I don't have your permission to be publicly on the internet, but you asked about this question, and I promised to get to it, so I am now. So a lot of people ask, is this binding? So the short and positive answer is no, it is not legally binding, but there's a big but, actually a couple of big buts. So these are my thoughts on that. So these three documents, the Pact itself and then the two annexes, were proposed to the assembled diplomats at the General Assembly meeting. They're not treaties and are non-binding. However, their intention is to create the impression that all the world's nations are begging for change and that the UN should be at the center of these changes. They serve as member state endorsements of the agendas, which are then interpreted as instructions to the United Nations system and used to guide budgetary and policy plans going into the future. They'll subsequently be referenced and characterized in documents and resolutions as a commitment that all governments will be pressed to honor. And having joined the consensus in approving the Pact, UN officials and other governments will contend that the US supported this language and will accuse America of violating its commitments if it fails to heed the action items included in the Pact. So they've built up basically a large club with this that they can use. But the biggest reason I think we have to be concerned about it, even though it's non-binding, is the concept of the public-private partnership. So for anyone who's not familiar with this concept, this is basically a form of fascism that was seen in both Nazi Germany and in Mussolini's Italy during World War II in slightly different ways, where you get an amalgamation of the public sector government with the private sector corporations. And they basically use each other to their own benefit. And we saw this during COVID a lot, where people were asking us to do things that weren't strictly legal or constitutional, like, wear a mask or you're not allowed in this building was a really big one, especially at the outset. And it was true that there was nothing here at our county level, for example, that explicitly said that that had to be true. But what happened is they would talk to private businesses and corporations and say, for example, Costco, will you please keep out anyone who's not wearing a mask? And Costco would basically say, yes, we'll do that. And so they did that. So what was it illegal for us to go into Costco without a mask? No. But because Costco is a private corporation, they had the right to tell us to stay out. So it was kind of a sleight of hand, right? And so that's what I see happening with something like the Pact. And so what I envision happening is corporations being tasked with enforcing rules that the government technically cannot do. And this is going to happen in several sectors. And to do research on this slide, I went to Forbes. Thank you, Forbes. You're good for something. And I looked up the wealthiest countries in the world in 2024 and divided them into categories, because I think those are the ones who are going to be probably most likely to do this. So in the financial sector, you're going to have the banks like JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and so on. And they will, especially with the increasing move toward digital currency, be able to enforce more and more as private entities, which they are. They're not quasi-governmental like the World Bank. They're absolutely private institutions. Big tech is going to be another one. Things like Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet, Apple, Meta, and so on. They're going to be in a position to allow us access. So if you don't give us your biometrics, you don't get onto Web 3.0. and so on, things like that. If your social credit score bottoms out below a certain number, it doesn't matter how many times you log in, you're not going to be able to access. Oh, but you will log in no matter what. No more anonymous access. Health, United Health Group is a huge player right now, and it looks like they're going to be tapped to kind of be the private and most premier institution regulating health stuff, along with the World Health Organization. But other companies like J&J, Procter & Gamble, and so on. Telecom is really big here. Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, and Broadcom. They can cooperate with big tech and also with the financial institutions. But they're going to be the ones who are able to manage your access on the ground, not just to the internet, which is the primary thing I'm concerned about, but to other utilities too, including just power. We've had a lot of struggles locally here with Verizon with their 5G masts in Tucson and other things. And remember that I'm connecting 5G to the Internet of Things, which is part of this interconnected information web that's going to be distilling data and sending it to places where it can be fused. Energy companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP, most people assume that they're all about fossil fuels, but they're not anymore. A lot of them have extensions into the renewable sector, quote unquote, looking at things like solar, wind, and so on. And so they stand to be big players in sort of navigating toward the pivot toward renewable energy, along with a lot of other companies who are startups, and they do that just, in and of themselves. And then finally, retail. So big companies like Walmart, Home Depot, Costco. I mentioned what Costco did. These are the big box stores that no one ever seemed to pick on during the pandemic. They were always open, business as usual while they closed mom and pop stores down. And I think that they're going to be tasked with enforcing some of this too. There's an author named David Hughes who I highly recommend. He's written this book called COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. I've actually got it right here. I was just going to blow it up and show you real quick what it looks like, because he has it available online as a free download, which is where I got this. And it's really good because it's a 400-page book that he could charge as a hardback, probably $35-40 for at least through a publisher. But I have found it very useful, and I wanted to take a few quotes from it to sort of underscore what I'm talking about. So what he says in part of this book is that an undeclared global class war was initiated in 2020, whose aim is the controlled demolition of liberal democracy and the institution of global technocracy, a novel biodigital form of totalitarianism that threatens to lead to the irreversible enslavement of humanity. World War III looks nothing like its two predecessors and is waged by the transnational deep state against populations using the novel methods of omniwar, i.e. war waged in every domain but clandestinely so that the public does not recognize it as such, which is key. The opening campaign of World War III involved the largest psychological warfare operation in history, which I call the COVID-19 operation. This was intended to demoralize, disorientate, and debilitate the public, thus weakening its resistance to the intended transition to technocracy. Finally, historically, psychological warfare has served as the prelude to physical war, raising the alarm concerning what is to come. And that's one of the reasons why I'm concerned about some of the disarmament topics with the Pact of the Future, because I consider that to be a bit ominous. And he lists some key players in this. And so just briefly, he lists the major investment banks, central banks, BIS, intelligence agencies, in particular CIA, MI5, MI6, the Mossad, as well as military intelligence, major tax-exempt foundations used by the powerful families, so like Rockefeller, Ford, Bill and Melinda Gates foundations, Soros's Open Society foundations, Carnegie, and so on. Major think tanks like Chatham House, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome. Shameless plug, if you want to know more about a lot of what I'm listing on this slide, go to our podcast for the first season. Tara and I have actually covered a lot of these. And then coordinators of transnational capital, such as the WEF, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderberg Group. By the way, the WEF and the United Nations signed Landmark's agreement in 2019, a cooperative agreement, which basically brought them into alignment in a formal sense for anyone who didn't know that. International organizations that are increasingly coming to set policy at a global level, for example, the WHO with the Pandemic Treaty, the UN with this Pact for the Future, and so on. The biggest institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. The establishment-aligned media, without which propaganda and psychological warfare against the public would not be possible. Big tech companies responsible for the technocratic control grid, which I've mentioned previously. Finally, the heads of big pharma and the regulators, which facilitated the experimental injections into billions of people, which he, I believe, rightly considers to have been a military operation and an act of war in its own sense. So I went back to Forbes, so we're going to come back to me now. Thank you, David Hughes. Again, please read his work. I went to Forbes to find the richest people in the world, just to kind of see who they are, because there seems to be this movement right now to take these oligarchs and start to treat them as though they are quasi-potentates who are involving themselves in wars. You know, like Elon Musk did with Ukraine, for example. They're buying up land. They are suing entire countries. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And I list the top 10 here. And I want to start talking about, especially since this is a libertarian talk, about why I think this reinforces what we think about the duopoly. Because I'm going to try to make a brief argument about why the main parties don't matter here, because the major people who are being tapped to actually step into running this technocracy are not party affiliated, and they may make sort of like gestures in the public eye in one way or another, to gain popularity from people who care very much about party politics, but ultimately it's beneath them. But just so you know where they're coming from, so two of them are formerly Trump supporters, Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen. If you've never heard of Mark Andreessen, remember that name. He's going to be important in just a minute. There's two Harris supporters in this top 10. There's George Soros and Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt is one of the two original CEs of Google, which became Alphabet. And then there are 5 people here. Oops, sorry, I guess this is the top 9. I think I cut it off at over so many billion. You've got Sergey Brin, also with Alphabet, who is the ex-husband of Nicole Shanahan, who's the running mate of RFK Jr. You've got Bill Gates with Microsoft, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, Mark Zuckerberg, Meta, and Larry Ellison, who was the founder and CEO of Oracle, the software platform, for anyone who's worked with Oracle. Again, I bet you have, and I bet you have. Anyone else? Oh yeah, you have. Okay. Again, I'm not saying names because this is going to be public. And so it's interesting how this breaks down this way. And then to underscore this, I want to talk about what's been happening with the attempt to establish a couple of big tech communities at 2 different levels by some of these people who I think are would-be oligarchs. The first example I want to give you is California Forever. Has anyone heard of California Forever? Okay, so California Forever is this American real estate development corporation founded by a guy named John Schramek. Through its subsidiary Flannery Associates, it's anonymously purchased over 50,000 acres of farmland in southeastern Solano County, California, on the edge of the Bay Area. In August of last year, the company announced the East Solano plan to build a new walkable city of up to 400,000 people on 17,500 acres of land. So the scope that we're talking about is huge. You've got 50,000 altogether, and within that, this essentially a 15-minute city model. That's what they mean by walkable city. And it would be an autonomous zone. So the people who are trying to buy this land would be the people who dictated the law and the policy within this zone. And it's interesting that people locally are fighting this tooth and nail, irrespective of party. Both Republicans and Democrats are fighting them. It's one of the things that's one of the only things I've seen this year that's unified people who otherwise associate with both parties to come together against something like this. But I'm going to list the company's backers for you because I want you to know the names. So they include the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, as well as several prominent Silicon Valley investors. So there's Michael Moritz from Sequoia Capital, Lorraine Jobs, who's Steve Jobs' widow, Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn, Mark Andreessen, there's that guy, Chris Dixon, they're both from Andreessen Horowitz, Patrick Collison and John Collison of Stripe, Nat Friedman of GitHub, and finally Daniel Gross, of Y Combinator. And so they have all aligned to basically support each other in acquiring this piece of California real estate, to essentially do whatever they want with, to be completely autocratic. Now, even more concerning than that is Prospera. Who's heard of Prospera? Anyone? Okay, Prospera, I couldn't believe this when I first saw this a couple weeks ago. The news about this broke recently, although it's been underway longer than that. So it's a private city and special economic zone on the island of Roatan in the Central American state of Honduras. The city is an autonomous zone with its own fiscal, regulatory, and legal architecture, again, dictated by the people who want to create it. It's a semi-autonomous city established under Honduran Zone for Employment and Economic Development, abbreviated CEDE. That's a recent acronym that's come into the news lately, laws, inspired by the concept of charter cities like Tucson, and cities such as Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai. The project is managed by Honduras Prospera Incorporated and is financed by several investors and venture capital firms, including this guy, Balaji Srinivasan, who I believe is a crypto guy, Peter Thiel, who is, he's been in the news a lot as the person who's been grooming and financing J.D. Vance. He was one of the creators of PayPal. He also was involved in Alphabet and is a venture capital guy who claims to be libertarian but is actually anything but, if you study him. And then Mark Andreessen, he's involved here again too. And they're involved through the venture capital company Pronomos Capital. And I haven't put this on the slide, but I did some research on this. And these people have actually been involved, I think, a couple of times in soft regime changes in Honduras, trying to get their way. And they have also literally sued the nation of Honduras in international court to try to bang through this. Their collective net worth is larger than the GDP of Honduras as a nation, and that's why they're able to do this, because they have so much damn money between them. And so again, this is, I'm giving these to you as examples of where I think we're going with the Pact for the Future, being mediated through public-private partnerships and people who are able to enforce them, because I don't think it's a party issue. So David, I'm blanking on his name. Who was it? David Hughes listed intelligence agencies as one of the primary agents of control in that list I read to you earlier. I got curious and I wondered how many intelligence agencies we actually had just in the US. So I went and I looked it up, and I know there's a lot, but I didn't realize there was this.
There's got to be way more than that.
Well, exactly. So you there in the middle row, what you're saying is exactly true, because you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say there's probably even more than this. This is what's available publicly. But even with just that, I just want to give you a rundown real quick, because the intelligence agencies are notorious for working outside of the law and outside of the scope of the national governments. Which is why JFK wanted to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Roughly speaking, right? I mean, there's details. So here's the list. So there's the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI. Everyone knows the CIA, but take a look here at the DOD, which is basically the federal agency that was primarily behind Project Warp Speed, or Operation Warp Speed. Operation Warp Speed. They have the DIA, the NSA, the NGA, the NRO, the MIC, the MCI, the ONI, 16AF, and DEL-18, which is the Space Intelligence Agency, which I find interesting. So the DoD themselves umbrellas 9 different intelligence agencies, fully functioning and independent but interdependent with each other. Then we've got the Department of Energy. They've got one, the Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. Department of Homeland Security, probably not surprisingly, has 2, Coast Guard Intelligence and then the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis. The US DOJ, they've got 2 and 0.5. So they've got the DEA, Office of National Security Intelligence, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so the FBI falls under the DOJ, as most people probably realize. But then the FBI has their own intelligence agency, which is the FBI Intelligence Branch. So an intelligence agency within an intelligence agency, within a federal agency. And then the Department of State has the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and the U.S. Department of the Treasury has the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. So these are all agencies which I think would be very operative and stakeholders, to use that term, in this global governance package going into the future. I also looked up federal agencies, and I decided to take it out of my presentation because it would make it too long. I know I'm already going a little bit long as it is. And I'm toward the end, just so you know. But I encourage everyone to look up our federal agencies because we have 13 overarching agencies, but each of them clicks open to so many sub-levels. And you should study what they do. Like, you would be surprised what the Department of Energy does. It's not what you think. Part of it is what you think. But there's parts of the DOE that do things that you would not guess, including, for example, being the host for the Human Genome Project, right? What does that have to do with DOE? And that's not the only example. So I'm not going to go into it, but please go do your own reading. It's fascinating. Okay. Now, one of the last things that I want to talk about is something that we've discussed on our podcast a little bit, which is the distinction between what I refer to as Tier 1 and Tier 2 policy items. And what these are is basically Tier 2 is below Tier 1, as the numbers indicate. And they are part of the Hegelian dialectic, a problem-reaction solution model, where we induce an artificial problem, we get a reaction, usually one of fear and anger, and then we provide you with a preconceived solution. So an example of that is 9/11. The solution that was preconceived was the USA Patriot Act. It is well known that it was drafted before 9/11 happened itself, so they were looking for an excuse for it, and 9/11 presented them with the problem to get the reaction, which was fear and anger, so that they could pass it through Congress without half of them reading the damn thing, or maybe even more, I don't remember at this point. So Tier 2 issues, let me say right now, these are real issues. I'm not saying that these are fake in any way, and I'm not saying that they're unimportant. They are important, real issues. But what makes them Tier 2 is they're highly visible, very polarizing, and they're begging for solutions. So they include things right now that we see all the time in social media, on the news, in political forums, and so on. So things like abortion, transgenderism, LGBTQ+ and identity politics, immigration, crime and justice, election integrity, and economy and inflation, and to a certain degree, climate change. Climate change is a little bit of a gray area between these two tiers, but it gets talked about in the way that Tier 1 issues that I'm about to show you don't. And what these are meant to do is inflame people and get them at each other's throats. So Republicans and Democrats everywhere, and I know it's not only them, but these tend to be seen as red and blue issues, they're being set at each other's throats about all of these issues right now. And again, they're real issues. I'm not saying that there's not a right or wrong. Not all of them are necessarily black or white, but right and wrong is not the point. The point is they're polarizing and they get people to fight each other so no one looks up. In contrast to these are Tier 1 issues. So these, in contrast, are less visible, non-polarizing, and presented as largely technological solutions to things. And so they include things like 5 and 6G, the IoT and IOB, artificial intelligence is a big one, quantum computing, biodigital convergence, biometrics, digital IDs and surveillance, blockchain and digital currency, geoengineering, and then again the space fence, which encompasses things like the LEO satellites, and then future things like weapons, mining, and so on, space operations that they're looking at. And what I want you to notice here is that ultimately these lock in directly to what I've been discussing with the Pact of the Future, more than the Tier 2 issues. So these are central items along the roadmap, but nobody ever talks about them. So when you get those flyers in the mail that I've been getting every day, I'm guessing you are too, from both parties, you'll see all sorts of stuff about this stuff on them and, mudslinging, name calling, and so on. Whoever talks about these, right? You almost never see these. But ultimately, these, I think, and I'm asserting, are the most important things. So I'm going to take 4 categories, and I'm just going to illustrate how on either side of the aisle, there's, I think, an absolute convergence for these topics that are all technocratic. So we're going to start with 5G. I'm just going to read some quotes, and I have website links here if anyone wants to get them from me so you can verify them or do more research. So a quote from Trump: "I want to thank you all for being here to discuss a critical issue for our country's future, winning the race to be the world's leading provider of 5G cellular communications networks." That was in 2017, and then he passed an executive order about it, which in turn allowed our governor at the time, Doug Ducey, to pass his own order, allowing, in Ducey's words, Arizona to be a 5G leader for the nation. And that's when it started rolling out. Compare this to Biden. I mean, right?
Well, and I'll take credit too, because I directed the teams that installed the 5G in all of Arizona and Nevada.
There you go. Thank you for your good work there, anonymous audience person. And within the context, you made a difference. So compare this with Biden. Expanding 5G and promoting competition in internet service are critical priorities of mine. Okay, the next topic, artificial intelligence. First, I'll go with Trump. The Trump administration is committed to strengthening American leadership in artificial intelligence. Recognizing the strategic importance of AI to the nation's future economy and security, the Trump administration established the American AI Initiative via Executive Order 13859 in February of 2019. President Biden signed a landmark executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. As the United States takes action to realize the tremendous promise of AI while managing its risks, the federal government will lead by example and provide a model for the responsible use of the technology. Notice neither of them are questioning, should we do it at all? It's all about, we're going to govern it, and here's what we're doing toward that end. Quantum computing. Trump. The National Quantum Initiative Act is an act of Congress passed on December 13th, 2018 and signed into law on December 21st, 2018. The law gives the United States a plan for advancing quantum technology, particularly quantum computing. The act was passed unanimously by the United States Senate and was signed into law by President Donald Trump. Biden. Today, President Biden will sign 2 presidential directives that will advance national initiatives in quantum information science, QIS, signaling the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to this critical and emerging technology. It doesn't say quantum computing specifically, but that's what it's talking about. And if you're not familiar with why I'm picking on quantum computing right now, it's critical for the blockchain technology that people are talking about, because blockchain technology is a distributed ledger technology that people want to move all of our information onto for various reasons. Finally, biometrics and digital ID. Trump's biometric entry-exit tracking system will apply also to American citizens. The facial recognition technology that the system uses to identify travelers leaving the country will be used to identify American citizens too, unless they request an alternative means of verifying their identities. The Biden administration is laying the groundwork for wider acceptance of digital identifications, like driver's licenses you can show on your smartphone, a push that could fundamentally reshape how citizens access everything from public benefits to pornography online. And so I wanted to use those. I could go into other areas. I chose to limit it to 4, partly for the sake of time. But again, what I wanted you to take away, and I'm not trying to pick on anyone in a personal way. I'm not trying to say that Biden's a horrible person, Trump's a horrible person. For anyone out there who may be covert fans, even though you're here at a libertarian meeting. But I'm saying that for whatever reason, they have bought into this technocratic agenda, hook, line, and sinker, and they are pursuing it in a uniparty way, full speed ahead. One other example I can give is the smart wall at the southern border. That's being developed through the company Anduril. And Anduril has worked with both the Trump and the Biden administrations proactively to start building out the smart wall. And what it involves is a combination of biometrics, cameras, sensors, drones, and potentially robotics and unmanned vehicles to police the wall. And we've talked here before about how people talk about the wall being something to keep people out, but the covert use actually being to keep us in. And one of the pieces of proof I have for that, besides the razor wire being inside instead of outside, is that there's an initiative to connect the smart wall along the border and move cameras up I-19. And so, why would they need to do that if it was all about keeping people out, right? So this is hardcore surveillance technology, and again, it has been supported by both the Trump and Biden-Harris administrations cooperatively. So, okay, I'm just about at the end. Final slide, guys. These are the takeaways I want to do before we break for Q&A if people have the stamina. The great work, which I started with, the various names for it, the New World Order, the Great Reset, etc., is about a fundamental transformation of our economy, culture, and our basic biology. It's about transmuting our entire world for the benefit of a small class of people who want to rule us, essentially. In line with what David Hughes argues, I agree. We are at war, even if it is not immediately obvious. This is first and foremost fifth-generation warfare, using psychological tactics to deprogram and then reprogram our minds. So basically, using a combination of techniques learned from the military and the intelligence agencies to break our will so that we can be deconstructed and then reconstructed in the image of the agenda. Fifth generation warfare, if you're not familiar with it briefly, is primarily psychological in nature. It's not kinetic. It has to do with basically learning how to manipulate people inside their minds, which is the most efficient kind of warfare. Because if you are able to do that, absolutely, you never have to put a boot on the ground, you never have to put a drone in the sky. But this will probably involve some of both, because they haven't absolutely perfected that. Conventional systems, and I have an extra word there. I'll take that out later. Conventional systems are being weaponized against us. Reliance on traditional institutions to defend ourselves is no longer the best strategy because of the workarounds that are being developed and the outer skin of artificial legislation that is being wrapped around our actual legislation at the national levels. So what I argue is that establishing a new community-based paradigm of living which breaks with the old is our best chance of surviving and thriving. And that's why I think that it's important to focus first at the community level, establishing networks, friends, peer groups, and people who are able to provide services so that we're able to coordinate and meet each other's needs when the services that we normally rely on are gradually but surely taken away and removed from us under this program. So that's a wrap. I appreciate your time. I know it's nearly 8 o'clock right now. And so, yeah, you can bring the lights up if you'd like, if that's what. And Derby, I mean, you're right there. Feel free to hit those, because if you want to do Q&A, I'm willing to do it. Drew, is there something that needs to be attended to?
No.
Technologically?
Well, I will need my phone back.
Oh,
but
how soon do you need it back? Like right now?
Don't end it because you're going to do Q&A, right?
Yeah, well, let's see. Just let me know if there's an emergency, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so last night Q&A was short, could be tonight too, but I'm up for it as long as you guys want to, as long as it's feasible. So does anyone have any questions?
No, I thought it was interesting what you said about United Health.
Mm-hmm.
I just read something recently that said they had a huge hack and millions of
You know what
And
else?
so that makes a lot of sense.
You know what else just happened today? They just laid off a huge amount of American workers because they are going to the next stage of their infrastructure, which is a combination of moving things to India and going all digital. And literally just today.
One of the thoughts behind data breaches is that that will push everyone into a situation where they're like, oh my gosh, we need some sort of digital ID that we can make sure we're us.
Yes.
And that's that Hegelian doctrine again.
The Hegelian dialectic. No, exactly, Derby, I agree. And I know more people this year personally who have been involved in some sort of a security breach or a hack than I've ever heard in my entire life. And I am convinced that a large part of it is deliberate toward this end.
Gas.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a form of cyber terrorism, which is presenting the problem to evoke the reaction of fear and anger so that people will not only accept, but they will ask for the solution of people coming in with stronger forms of digital control so we don't get hacked anymore.
And that's the same with immigration and voting,
Right,
that the masses are gonna ask for it.
right, exactly.
That one.
Yeah.
It goes back to the global versus local argument, because the argument of tyrants is always that they will take over the world and produce prosperity.
And they'll be
for
benevolent
everyone.
dictators.
Right, and that's always the promise. But I mean, this may be the first time that a global body has voted to,
To
more or less
actually
endorse a particular plan to globalize the entire economy of the world.
Right. No, and so this is why I think this is so important, because despite what we discussed about the binding aspects here and there, this is implicitly giving agreement to the general blueprint for a global government and everything it entails and the specific directions they want to move there, through the sustainable development goals, disarmament, the digital world, and then through the youth. Yeah.
But I think it's important that we as libertarians recognize that some of these things can be beneficial by themselves without being part of a global government.
No, absolutely. And so I fully agree with that too. There are some things that I've gone over here that in isolation and under other guidance, or maybe under even more organic grassroots guidance, could be beneficial. Absolutely. It's about the way that they are being employed systematically and interoperably. Yeah.
I mean, right now, you talked about global communications, but there's only two organizations that have global communications that operated in the middle of the Pacific.
Okay.
And that would be the U.S. Navy,
Uh-huh.
which built a satellite network in the 50s,
Right.
and Elon Musk.
Right.
And
Right.
so those two organizations are the only ones who have communications on deserted islands in the South Pacific.
Right. Exactly. And they have something of a monopoly.
Exactly. But of course, from the 50s until now,
Uh-huh.
the U.S. Navy had that monopoly.
Right. Well, and that's a valid point as well. Exactly. But what is happening in the case of something like Starlink is it's being played up in a purely positive way in the media. Look how useful it was in North Carolina. Look how positive it was in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not to say that it could not be used in a positive way, but I think that a lot of that is basically window dressing so that people will accept it, not push back. And then ultimately, once it's instantiated...
Well, and isn't that the way all government programs are always implemented?
Yes.
NASA did great things for 10, 15 years,
even though they started their cyborg program in 1957.
but they did send people to the moon.
Right.
I mean, I believe they really did.
No, I do too, yeah.
But of course, they became a government bureaucracy, and
Right.
now they produce virtually nothing and consume huge amounts of resources.
Well, and the other thing too is that NASA, I believe, was always dual use, because don't forget that they're largely a product of, just like the CIA, of Project Paperclip, where we split the Nazi scientists between at that time the Soviet Union and the United States. And we brought the better ones for the most part here, and then we populated our newly reformed intelligence agency. It had been the OSS, which then became the CIA when we placed Nazis in charge. And then the same thing happened with NASA, because we were using their rocket technology. And so I believe that there's good reason to think that there was always a covert agenda from day one with NASA, but they needed to do things that provided a good public image on the other side. And not that those were fake necessarily, but I think they were covered for some of their covert.
But I would argue the anti-conspiratorial argument, which is that these are thousands of independent efforts that each one of which people are pushing because they think that particular agenda, and then a few people are taking advantage of all of these thousands of independent real efforts and saying, oh, what you're doing is part of the global,
Yeah. No, well, and the key thing there is how they're distributed. I think that in most agencies, not just NASA and other organizations, most of the people are probably not nefarious. All you have to have are the few people who are nefarious at the top rungs of leadership, coordinating all those different programs together with an ulterior motive. Right?
which is why we need independent competing organizations and corporations and in private ownership rather than global ownership.
Right, no, that definitely would help. So the one thing that we have to figure out as libertarians is how to find the Goldilocks situation where those corporations that are otherwise, as you say, a viable answer to that dilemma, how to prevent them from growing so large that they themselves become a monopoly and create some of the problems I've discussed.
But things like COVID were certainly engineered or twisted
Yes,
to knock out a lot of tiny organizations
absolutely.
and force all of the big ones to prosper.
It gave them a huge advantage. Yeah, it took an already asymmetrical playing field and tilted it this way. Oops. Yeah. So, Sue-Ann.
One of the things that you mentioned
Uh-huh.
was that in the facial recognition, that you're going to be subjected to it unless you say you don't want it.
That was in a 2017 or a 2018 version.
Well,
Yes.
what I wanted to say, and it isn't so much a question, is that currently when you go through Tucson International, they want you to go through with your ID, and then they have a square, and everybody just walks up automatically and gives them their ID, and
Right.
then stands in front of it, and that's facial recognition. But
Yeah.
what I learned was, I asked them, is this facial recognition? And they said, yes. I said, I don't want it. They turned it off. So that was a denial of it, and it is something people don't even, you're just so conditioned, you're watching everybody else do it.
Right,
And
exactly.
Yes.
They're not offering to turn it off anymore though. It already does it. I just heard somebody complaining about that within the last week.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I'll find out.
I keep my body out of the viewfinder.
Uh-huh.
And
you
when
walk
they-
with a hat on or something.
I have facial recognition blocking glasses.
Wear your
but-
COVID mask.
Yeah,
that
up
doesn't
here.
work. All you have to say is no thank you. I stay out of
Yes.
the screen and
Yes.
say no thank you, and they're like, fine, and they take my ID and look at it and let me go.
Right.
Exactly, that's the point I wanted to make. is
But
that
they
it's-
do.
You can deny it, and it's just that conditioning. People just do it automatically.
Look at Costco. No one knows, they're scanning their cards.
These
No one
days.
knows. Yeah, they're popping up their faces on the back side of the screen.
Oh.
It's it's your Costco picture, you know. that,
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's fine, yeah.
But it's conditioning us to be ready for the biometrics
Yeah.
with Costco.
And then to finish that thought, and thank you for that, because I absolutely agree, and I think it is important to opt out no matter what, and to exercise that right. When I've been through airport scanners recently or through checkpoints, one of the things that they will tell me is, yeah, you can opt out, but it doesn't really matter because we've got your face on all the other cameras throughout the airport anyway.
That's
Right.
why I wear my facial recognition glasses the
Yeah.
entire time I'm in the airport.
Right, no, that's good, that's good. But the move is to condition everyone so that we don't care at all. But I think it's important to be aware that there are a growing number of cameras out there that are capturing our data, but nevertheless to still exercise that right, because part of it is setting an example for
Yes.
other people.
Yes.
Even the people that we're speaking directly to who are at the checkpoint itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, okay, anything else? Okay, if anyone thinks of anything else, you know where to find me. I'm going to wrap this up so we can get the phone back into the hands of its rightful owner. But thank you very much, everyone. You've been a wonderful audience, asked great questions, and I appreciate your attendance.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Peter.
Annie.
Yes, you're very welcome.